Keanu Reeves stood in the first-class line, dressed simply, a stark contrast to the luxury around him. A man watched him with disdain, unable to hide his arrogance. What happened next would leave everyone on that plane completely speechless and forever change one life. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another special story for you. The Los Angeles airport was as busy as always, people coming and going, conversations blending together, and luggage rolling in all directions. In the middle of it all, a man stood calmly in the first-class line. That man was Keanu Reeves. He was dressed simply, a plaid shirt, worn-out jeans, and scuffed boots. He carried a backpack that looked like it had traveled the world with him. There was nothing flashy about him, and perhaps because of that, he went unnoticed. Yet anyone who took a closer look could sense something different about him. It wasn't just the way he dressed, but the calmness he exuded. He seemed like someone who didn't let the chaos around him affect his peace. While everyone else appeared rushed and anxious, Keanu stood there tranquil. He observed everything around him, as if soaking in the moment. He didn't mind the glances or the stark contrast between himself and the other passengers. Right behind him in the line was Victor Harding. Victor was the complete opposite of Keanu. He wore an expensive suit, polished shoes, and a cologne that demanded attention. Every movement he made seemed rehearsed, as though he wanted the world to know he was someone important. His eyes quickly scanned the line, and when they landed on Keanu, he couldn't hold back his comment. "First class, huh?" Victor said, with an ironic smile. You never know who might show up here these days. Keanu turned his head and looked at him, keeping his expression. He was a man of his word. He was a man of his word. He was a man of his word. Yeah, the world is full of surprises. Victor frowned for a moment. He seemed to expect a bigger reaction, something that would confirm what he thought about the man in front of him. But Keanu stayed quiet, as if the comment didn't matter. Victor decided to push further. "Look, nothing personal, but you don't seem like the type who flies like this," he said, chuckling softly. "It's rare to see someone so casual in first class." The moment to board had arrived. The first-class line began moving forward, and Keanu and Victor, without exchanging any more words, followed with their tickets in hand. Victor, as usual, walked with firm, confident strides, while Keanu seemed oblivious to the commotion around him, walking at the same calm pace as before. When they finally entered the plane, the unexpected happened. Upon reaching his seat, Victor checked his ticket once more, and as he looked up, saw Keanu settling into the seat right next to his. "You've got to be kidding me," Victor muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. He sat down beside Keanu and let out a low chuckle, as if the situation was a joke. Of all the places possible, it had to be here. Keanu simply looked at him with that same calm demeanor and gave a slight smile. "Looks like we're traveling together then," he replied politely. Victor crossed his arms, trying to hide his discomfort. It wasn't just the fact that he was sitting next to Keanu, but the thought that the man he had judged minutes ago was now sharing the same exclusive space as him. He couldn't quite explain why, but Keanu's presence unsettled him in a way he couldn't ignore. As the economy class passengers finished boarding, Victor decided to strike up a conversation, but not in a friendly way. "So, what do you do for a living?" he asked, with the casual tone of someone who already thought they knew the answer, but wanted confidence. Keanu, who was adjusting his backpack under the seat in front of him, looked up and answered simply, "I work in film." Victor raised his eyebrows. as if surprised. "Oh, I see. Commercials? Small-time stuff?" Keanu gave a slight smile and shook his head. "Something like that." Victor laughed. "I've always found it interesting how people try to find their place, you know? But sometimes certain spaces just aren't meant for everyone. Like first class, for instance." Keanu looked at him for a moment, assessing the situation, but maintained his calm demeanor. "I think we all have our place," Keanu replied. "And sometimes it's exactly where we are." Victor let out a short laugh. "That's nice, kind of philosophical even. But real life isn't that simple." Keanu didn't respond immediately. He just turned back to the window as if the conversation was over. But Victor wasn't done yet. "You know what?" Victor said. Keanu said, leaning slightly toward him. "You might be sitting here, but there are things money can't buy. Some places will never really belong to certain people." This time, Keanu didn't respond with words. He simply looked at him for a moment, with an expression that combined patience and a certain firmness. It was the kind of look that said more than any words ever could. Victor, realizing his provocation hadn't had the desired effect, leaned back into his seat with a satisfied smile. He thought he had the upper hand in the situation, but the truth was that things were only just beginning. Victor was convinced he was in control. But Keanu's calmness hid something he couldn't foresee. With every passing minute, what seemed like a simple conversation was turning into something much bigger. With the plane already in the air, the in-flight service began. The flight attendant moved through first class, offering drinks, and Victor made sure to be noticed. "A glass of champagne, please," he said with a confident smile, something that matches the exclusivity of this seat. The flight attendant, accustomed to demanding passengers, nodded with a professional smile. When it was Keanu's turn, he made a simple request. "Just water, please." Victor didn't miss the opportunity to comment. He looked at Keanu with that same air of superiority and let out a chuckle. "Water?" he asked, almost laughing. "Don't tell me you're going to waste the experience of flying first class with water." Keanu took the bottle the flight attendant handed him and replied calmly, "I'm fine with this. Sometimes simplicity is enough." Victor narrowed his eyes, as if trying to decipher the answer, but quickly decided to push back. "Yeah, I guess that works for people who settle for less. Not everyone is born to enjoy the best life has to offer." Keanu raised the bottle and took a small sip, not responding immediately. Other passengers began to notice Victor's provocative tone, but since Keanu appeared unbothered, no one intervened. "Maybe the best is different for everyone," Keanu finally said, with the same calmness as always. Victor didn't like the answer. He took a deep breath, trying to maintain control of the conversation. Or maybe people who say that just never had access to what really matters. Some things are beyond the reach of certain people, you know? The flight attendant, who was serving another passenger, cast a discreet glance in their direction, as if considering stepping in. But she noticed Keanu was handling the situation well. He responded with nothing more than a slight smile, turning back to look out the window. Victor, on the other hand, didn't seem satisfied. He wanted to provoke more, but was beginning to realize that Keanu was a difficult opponent to rattle. Victor was convinced he was winning the dispute, but for the passengers around them, his arrogance was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. While Keanu remained calm, Victor was about to face a reality that would completely change his views on people. The flight attendant returned to the section of the cabin where Keanu and Victor were seated. As she served another round of drinks, Victor decided to continue the conversation. or rather his string of provocations. "You know, life is like flying first class," he began, gesturing with his champagne glass. "You work hard, earn your spot, and then you get to enjoy it. But some people, well, it seems like they're only here because they got lucky." Keanu placed his water bottle on the seat tray and finally turned to face Victor. His gaze was calm, but there was something different in it now, as if he was ready to respond more directly. "Luck or hard work, we all end up in the same place when the flight lands, don't we?" Keanu said, his tone serene but firm. The passengers around them, who had previously been discreetly observing, began to pay closer attention. The cabin was almost uncomfortably silent. A few exchanged glances, noticing the subtle clash between the two. Victor smiled, clearly trying to hide that the response had hit him in some way. "Well, I wouldn't say that. Some of us are simply on a higher level. Not everyone understands the value of being here." Keanu leaned forward slightly, crossing his arms. "I think the value of being here," he gestured around the seat, "isn't about what you have, but how you treat others." Some passengers nodded slightly, while others exchanged approving glances. Victor, on the other hand, seemed uncomfortable. He tried to laugh it off, but his nervousness was starting to show. "That's a good one. First-class self-help philosophy. Maybe you should consider giving motivational talks," he said, trying to keep his tone sarcastic. Keanu simply gave a short smile and turned back to face forward, ending the conversation without saying anything more. His calmness seemed to speak louder than any words. The passengers around them began to react subtly. Some whispered to one another, while others looked at Victor with disapproving expressions. A couple sitting a few rows behind, who appeared to have recognized Keanu, remained silent, respecting his privacy, but clearly admiring the way he handled the situation. Victor, meanwhile, began to smile. Victor began to notice he was being watched, and not in a positive way. His posture, once so confident, began to shift slightly, but he still wasn't ready to admit he had lost control. Victor thought he was winning the dispute, but the reactions around him told a different story. He didn't yet know that what was coming next would make him question everything he believed about status, power, and respect. As the flight attendant passed by, collecting empty glasses, Victor seemed determined to win the debate. He had started. "You know what's funny?" Victor continued. "People who have nothing to show for themselves always talk about things like humility and simplicity. Ever notice that?" Keanu leaned forward slightly, looking Victor in the eye. "I've noticed that sometimes the people who talk the most about what they have are the ones who feel the emptiest inside." The words hung in the air for a few seconds, and Victor seemed momentarily stunned, struggling to find a response. He opened his mouth, but couldn't immediately form. Passengers around them exchanged glances, some visibly impressed by the way Keanu handled the provocations. "Look, I don't mean to be rude," Victor said, finally recovering. "But the world is competitive. If you don't show what you have, people will ignore you. That's just how things work." Keanu leaned back in his seat and replied calmly, "Maybe, but I think true success doesn't need to be shouted about. It speaks for itself." Keanu's words seemed to carry weight throughout the cabin. A few passengers nodded discreetly, while others shot disapproving looks at Victor, who clearly wasn't used to being challenged this way. By this point, the atmosphere in first class had shifted. Many passengers were now fully tuned into the exchange between Keanu and Victor. An older man sitting nearby turned to observe more closely, shaking his head as if to express disapproval of Victor's behavior. Victor, aware of the stares, tried to hide his irritation, but instead of backing down, he threw out another jab. Cheap philosophy. It might sound nice, but the real world doesn't work that way. Keanu looked at him, still maintaining the same tranquil expression. The real world is made by people, Victor, and in the end, how we treat others says more about who we are than anything else. Victor was visibly uncomfortable with the response. He glanced around, no doubt, noticing that the passengers' attention was no longer in his favor. Some whispered among themselves, while others stared directly at him, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval. Victor was beginning to realize that his strategy of dominance wasn't working. He thought he had the upper hand, but the impact of Keanu's words was changing the perception of the passengers, and perhaps even his own. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Victor crossed his arms, trying to mask the discomfort caused by Keanu's words, but his irritation was starting to show. Keanu, however, seemed unaffected by the atmosphere. He turned directly to Victor and broke the silence with a calm tone. You know, Victor, I understand what you're saying. The world can be very competitive, but I've learned that sometimes the need to prove something to others comes from something deeper, an insecurity, an inner struggle. Victor furrowed his brow, unsure whether this was a provocation or a genuine attempt at conversation. Inner struggle? He said, laughing. I don't know where you got that idea, but you couldn't be more wrong. Keanu gave a slight smile and shook his head. Maybe, but I've met many people who thought success was all about what others could see. Deep down, they were just trying to fill something missing inside them. The words hit Victor in an unexpected way. He fell silent for a moment, fiddling with the wedding band on his finger, almost at the same time. He was almost absent-mindedly, but he quickly recovered his defensive tone. That's not me. Everything I've achieved, I worked hard for, and I don't need anyone telling me how to live my life. Keanu remained calm, as if carefully choosing his next words. He observed Victor for a few seconds before continuing. I'm not saying you didn't work hard. I just think that sometimes we get so caught up in the idea of showing off what we've achieved that we forget to look inward. Who are we without all of this? Victor pressed his lips together, visibly uncomfortable. The question seemed to echo in his mind, but he wasn't ready to admit that it struck a chord. Who are we? He replied with a cynical laugh. We're what we build. Without it, we're nothing. Keanu, I think we're defined by what we do for others, not by what we accumulate. And in the end, the things we show the world matter less than what we carry inside. He pointed to his chest, and his words resonated throughout the cabin. Some passengers nodded subtly, while Victor appeared to struggle to maintain his composure. That's easy for you to say, Victor said, almost rising from his seat. You don't know anything about me. You don't know what I've been through to get here. Keanu responded firmly, but without raising his voice. You're right, I don't know your story. But I don't think I need to know it to see that sometimes, when someone feels the need to shout about what they've achieved, it's because they're trying to hide something. Fear, insecurity, loneliness. The statement hit like a brick. Victor froze, his face flushed with anger and perhaps shame. He clenched his fists, clearly struggling to contain an outburst. Victor, finally losing his composure, stood up abruptly, knocking his empty champagne glass to the floor. You think you're better than me? He shouted. I shouted, drawing the attention of everyone in the cabin. sitting there with your clever little phrases, acting like you know everything about life, but you don't know a thing about what it's like to live in the real world. The passengers fell silent, shocked by Victor's outburst. The flight attendant quickly approached, trying to defuse the situation. Keanu remained seated, looking at Victor calmly. He waited for the man to finish speaking before responding. "I don't think I'm better than you," he said, with a tone that was firm yet gentle. "I just think that sometimes we need to stop and think about what really matters. And Victor, you don't have to prove anything to anyone." The words seemed to strike Victor deeply. He was breathing heavily, but something in Keanu's voice made him sit down. He averted his gaze, looking more defeated than angry. Victor sat in silence, Keanu's words echoing in his mind. He had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable in front of so many people. But he still didn't know that the worst, or perhaps the best, was yet to come. The flight continued in a heavier silence after the confrontation. Victor remained in his seat, avoiding looking at Keanu, but it was evident he was deeply unsettled. Keanu, on the other hand, seemed completely relaxed, as if nothing had happened. A short while later, the flight attendant approached Keanu with a polite smile. Her voice caught the attention of the entire cabin. "Mr. Reeves, the captain asked me to inform you that your connection in Tokyo is confirmed. He also sends his best regards." The name Reeves seemed to echo through first class. Some passengers, who until then had been quietly observing, widened their eyes. A murmur began to spread through the cabin, and that's when "Reeves?" he murmured, almost in disbelief. "Keanu Reeves?" Keanu nodded politely to the flight attendant and thanked her, not paying much attention to the commotion. He turned to Victor, who now looked at him as if he were seeing a ghost. "Is something wrong, Victor?" Keanu asked with a slight smile. Victor opened his mouth but couldn't form a sentence. He looked around, noticing other passengers observing him with curious and, in some cases, disapproving glances. He looked completely lost. Victor sank into his seat, clearly uncomfortable. He began mumbling a few words, trying to justify his actions. I had no idea. I mean, you didn't say who you were," he finally said. "I didn't know that. You were you." Keanu kept his tone calm, but there was firmness in his words. "I didn't think it was necessary. I don't usually use my name as a calling card." Victor remained silent for a moment before attempting to defend himself. "Look, I didn't mean to offend you. I just didn't know who I was talking to." Keanu let out a small sigh and leaned forward slightly. "Victor, what you said doesn't change just because you now know my name. The truth doesn't depend on who you're speaking to. It depends on how you choose to treat people." The words left Victor speechless. He looked at Keanu, then at the other passengers, who now seemed even more attentive to what was unfolding. The humiliation on his face was undeniable. The silence in the cabin was broken by Keanu, who decided to conclude the conversation with a final lesson. "You know, Victor, it's hard enough for everyone. The last thing we need is people trying to put others down to make themselves feel bigger." Victor nodded slightly, unable to argue. For the first time, he seemed to genuinely reflect on his actions. Keanu leaned back in his seat, effectively ending the conversation. Meanwhile, Victor remained motionless, staring at his hands as if replaying every word in his mind. Victor wasn't just confronted by Keanu, but by reality itself. He began to realize that in his attempt to humiliate someone else, he had revealed more about himself than he ever intended. The rest of the flight was marked by a heavy silence. Victor, who once seemed like he owned the space, now looked visibly uncomfortable. He could barely meet the eyes of Keanu or the other passengers. The arrogance he carried at the start of the journey had disappeared, replaced by something much closer to shame. As the minutes passed, Victor couldn't see the world. He couldn't see the world. He couldn't see the world. He couldn't stop thinking about Keanu's words. Everything he had said seemed so simple, yet at the same time, it struck deeply. Victor began questioning his own behavior, recalling how many times he had judged people without even trying to know. Maybe he's right, he murmured to himself without realizing. He glanced at Keanu, who was calmly reading a book, as if nothing had happened. This only amplified the impact of the situation. Keanu hadn't made any effort to prove himself. He had simply said, as the plane began to prepare for landing. Victor finally mustered the courage to say something. He turned to Keanu, his eyes still lowered, and said, "I need to apologize. Not for what I said, just because you're you. But because I was arrogant. I acted like an idiot." Keanu looked at him, his expression as tranquil as ever. He waited a moment before responding. "I appreciate the apology. But more than that, I hope you learn from this." Victor nodded slowly, realizing that those words were an opportunity for change. Then Keanu continued, "Sometimes what we search for most in the world is what we find least within ourselves. I hope you figure out what really matters." Victor remained silent, but Keanu's words stayed in his mind. He knew that moment had the potential to change something inside him if he allowed it. After disembarking, Victor stood still in the terminal, watching Keanu walk away. He saw fans discreetly approach. Keanu's words still echoed in his mind, a reminder that a person's true worth isn't about their status, but about how they choose to treat others. As Keanu disappeared into the airport crowd, Victor turned to Keanu and said, Victor felt something new, hope. Maybe that encounter hadn't been a coincidence. Maybe it was a chance to start over. In the end, we all carry choices that shape who we are. Are we living to impress others or to become better people? Keanu's words leave a clear lesson. True success isn't about what you achieve or show off, but about the positive impact you leave on the world and the lives of those around you. So, the next time you find yourself in a situation of judgment or conflict, remember, respect and humility never go out of style. And perhaps the change you want to see in the world needs to start with you. If you enjoyed this story, we have many more that will warm your heart. Click the screen to explore more stories of hope, compassion, and resilience. We'll see you next time.